Hello and welcome to Committee Corridor. Below the ocean waves, there is a vibrant world full of life and rich in natural resources. The marine environment plays a crucial role in regulating the Earth's climate, but much of it is unprotected. Around 2/3 of the world's oceans are outside any single country's jurisdiction. That leaves the high seas wide open to potential threats, and there are many, from pollution and unsustainable fishing to damaging practices such as deep-sea mining, while rising temperatures put the survival of small island developing states in jeopardy. Today we're asking what's at stake and what is the UK doing about it? I'm Toby Perkins, the Labour Member of Parliament for Chesterfield and Chair of the House of Commons Environmental Audit Select Committee, also known as the EAC. As the third United Nations Ocean Conference drew to a close in France last month, there was a moment for celebration. More than 170 countries had adopted a political declaration promising urgent action to protect the ocean, to be known as the Nice Ocean Action Plan. Its main goals are to expand marine protection areas, limit marine pollution, and increase financial aid for coastal and island nations. A major objective of the conference was to make progress on the High Seas Treaty. This landmark United Nations agreement to protect ocean life will only become binding international law when it's been ratified by 60 countries. By the end of the conference, the number had ticked up to 50. The UK and the United States are not among them, though the UK might make some progress before the end of the year. Later we'll be talking to Sarah Champion, Chair of the International Development Committee, about why the UK needs to get on with it. And we'll be joined by Pippa Heylings, one of the Environmental Audit Committee's own members, to consider why our committee is concerned that the protection of the ocean is not demonstrably a priority for the government. But first, the Marine Conservation Society was at the UN Ocean Conference in Nice. It's the UK's leading ocean charity working for cleaner, better protected and healthier seas. Fiona Thomas is its Head of Parliamentary Affairs and she joins me now. Fiona, welcome to Committee Corridor.
Hi Toby, thank you for having me.
Let's talk about the High Seas Treaty. The High Seas Treaty is a welcome shorthand for its formal title, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea on the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Marine Biological Diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. Just to explain to our listeners, Fiona, why it's so important.
The High Seas Treaty is a piece of legislation led by the UN. This is an international treaty that would look to sort of put marine protected areas on the high seas. So the high seas are areas beyond national jurisdiction, so sort of outside national waters or so. So until quite recently, the high seas is quite an unregulated space. I think it's sort of overseen by a couple of bits of maritime law, but at the moment, there's nothing in there around marine protections. And so the High Seas Treaty would be a mechanism on which to put marine protected areas in the high seas to make sure that vulnerable habitats like seamounts, I'm sure some of you may have seen the David Attenborough film recently. There's a big coverage there of seamounts and like the vital contribution that they make ecosystems wise, but also more generally to our planet. And there's also a bit in the High Seas Treaty as well around equitable sharing of marine genetic resources. So in a technical way, that sort of aims to make sure that all proceeds and things like that of what is found on the high sea in terms of like scientific discoveries shared equally between nations, in particular small island developing states.
And in the UK, it's the government that negotiates and signs treaties. Once signed, it must be scrutinised by Parliament to confirm that the UK agrees to be bound by it. And primary legislation must be passed on the floor of the House to set obligations and make sure we can implement it. Only then may the treaty be ratified by the government formally, notifying the other parties that the UK will be bound by it from a specified date. The Prime Minister has now said the government will do this by the end of the year. Does that reassure you that the government is committed to protecting our seas?
So I think it's great that the government and Minister Hardy announced at the UN Oceans Conference that they're looking to ratify the High Seas Treaty by December 2025. I think up until now there hadn't been a sort of specific timeline on it, so great to hear that assurance. But We in the Marine Conservation Society, and I think other organisations across the board, would like to see this done as soon as possible. So ideally by the 20th of September. So this will be around the time of the UN General Assembly. If we do it by that deadline, it would mean that the UK has sort of say into the first COP, if you like, so the Conference of the Parties, where the treaty will sort of be implemented and the rules and regulations governing how it will be implemented will be discussed. So if we do it by that deadline, we'd have more of a say in that conference. It is heartening to see that commitment, but, we really want to see the government make time, crucially, for this bill to pass. And I think that was a recommendation that you yourselves reflected in the Environmental Audit Committee recent report on governing the marine inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the United States didn't send a high-ranking delegation to the summit. How alarmed should we be about the way that the United States are sort of treating this area right now?
I think it is concerning. We've seen NOAA, so National Oceanography and Atmospheric Body. So they are effectively, I think, a bit like the UK's Met Office, but they also do a lot of scientific research as well, most notably on the seas. We've seen a picture where there's been quite a lot of funding stopped around this, and also I think colleagues working in the USA as well have found that quite a lot of their funding has stopped for this vital ocean research. And I think more generally as well, it's quite concerning that, for example, the upcoming COP, Conference of the Parties in Brazil, so COP30 is going to come up in November this year. That seemed to be quite a big COP because countries will be reporting on how close they are to meeting the net zero emissions by 2050. Not having the US there as a key partner, and sort of, historically, on some things they've been pushing for quite high ambition in these areas, and sort of not having that vital influence in the room really is, again, quite concerning for global environmental ambition.
Yeah, and 2030 is another global target, this one to protect and conserve at least 30% of the world's land, freshwater and ocean by 2030. As Sir David Attenborough's support, what progress is the UK making towards this target, Fiona?
As seen in Nice, that the UK has announced some really good things recently. So you will have seen that there's been a proposed ban announced, sort of bottom trawling on 41 offshore MPAs. There was a number of sort of announcements around funding, so funding towards sort of small island developing states, and 4 million, I believe, toward coral reefs, and things like that are great, but we really sort of need to maintain that momentum and keep our foot on the pedal. There's sort of like 15 targets that the UK has to indicators of good environmental status, and so far the UK has sort of met 4 of them, I believe, at the last progress update. So there's clear that more momentum is needed, I think, in particular as we approach 2030.
Industrial fishing techniques have come in for criticism. The EAC, as you referred to there, called for a ban on bottom trawling in offshore marine protected areas. David Attenborough also flagged concerns in his recent film. Some have pushed back on claims of environmental damage. Bottom trawling is already banned in some English waters, and the government's now consulting on plans to extend the ban across all marine protected areas. Do you think that is the answer? And how encouraged are you by the government's recent announcements?
I think it is encouraging. And as far as we understand, this seems to be stage 3 of sort of a set of 4 bylaws, really, that the UK is looking to pass. And stage 4 will include more ambition. But I think it's not the whole picture. So at the Marine Conservation Society, we've sort of been pushing for a holistic marine spatial plan, really. So a marine spatial plan would sort of govern the use of the sea. If it works well, different interests would be balanced against each other, and it would sort of give a sort of overall picture of sea use. So as you reflected in the Environmental Audit Committee's report, currently this approach is quite a complicated regulatory system, and it's not really holistic. To our side, at least, it feels like it's looking primarily at the deployment of clean energy, which makes sense given the sort of the UK government to set a target now between 43 to 50 gigawatt of offshore wind by 2030. But this would also displace other sea users as well. So, of course, the fishery sector, more besides. So having a marine spatial prioritisation framework would also help us sort of understand where the additional pressures are being put on already degraded marine environments, and sort of make sure that they're reallocated in the less damaging places. So MPAs are certainly part of that picture, but I think, having a more holistic view, like a marine spatial prioritisation framework would do, I think would also be hugely helpful too.
And the Marine Conservation Society's campaigning about forever chemicals. Our committee has launched an inquiry into what's known as PFAS, perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl substances. This large, complex group of synthetic chemicals are used in a wide variety of everyday products. Why are they so significant?
They're really significant because in effect, they're coatings on or chemicals on products that make things grease-proof, heat-proof or waterproof. So as you can imagine, those are quite useful properties and therefore they're quite ubiquitous. And so one of the issues around the use of PFAS, their sort of nickname or moniker, if you like, is forever chemicals, because once they're in the environment, they sort of accumulate and persist for like thousands of years. So we're really sort of concerned about their uses. We did a piece of work with the University of Portsmouth, where we found that PFAS can sort of accumulate in seagrasses. So we did a study into seagrasses in Lanston Harbour. These seagrasses are sort of feeding grounds for fish and for other marine species as well. So we have a lot of concerns about, not least the marine species that are ingesting these products, but also there is potential for this to enter into the human food chain as well.
Yeah, sure. Any reason to be cheerful? How does the Marine Conservation Society measure any evidence of improvement?
There were some really great announcements at the UN Oceans Conference. So we're looking at the world's largest marine protected area was announced in French Polynesia, and it's nearly 5 million kilometres squared. So that's huge. The countries have backed a moratorium on seabed mining, which I think, there hadn't been a lot of momentum on this before this conference. So perhaps not so much on PFAS, but there's certainly lots of positive ocean stories out there that can be really heartened by.
And it feels like it's a real moment for the oceans. We've had David Attenborough's film. We've had the conference that you were referring to. Hopefully going to have 60 nations signed up to the High Seas Treaty by the end of this year. The marine environment's been sort of seen as the Cinderella, if you like, of the environment, the bit that hasn't had as much focus. Do you have any sense of optimism that we're finally, as a global community, understanding and taking action on the importance of the global marine environment?
I really do. And I think, as you just mentioned, Toby, I think the recent film Ocean by David Attenborough, I think, has been like a real galvanizing point for people who maybe, don't really encounter the ocean so much in their day-to-day lives. It's now publicly available, I believe, on streaming platforms and things like that. So it does feel like there's a lot of energy. And certainly in parliamentary events that the Marine Conservation Society has hosted and ones we've attended as well, it feels like, there's a lot more sustained interest in the marine environment. So, yeah, we're particularly grateful to the Environmental Audit Committee for the recent report and for providing that moment. This was the biggest UN Oceans Conference yet. And I think, they're only going to get bigger. There was, in addition to the UN Oceans Conference, there were also other side events as well. So there was the so-called Blue Economy Forum, there was the One Ocean Science Congress, and it feels like different types of communities who have a relationship with the sea are sort of coming together in a way that we haven't seen before, really. So, yeah, it does feel like there's a lot of energy out there and really looking forward to seeing more.
Well, Fiona Thomas, thank you so much for joining us on Committee Corridor and for the work you're doing.
Thank you.
There is a very real risk that rising sea levels will cause some of the world's most vulnerable countries to disappear underwater by the end of this century. The remote geography of some regions, known as small island developing states, leaves them particularly exposed to the impacts of climate change, putting their economies at risk too. The International Development Committee has been keeping up the pressure on the UK government to keep their climate and financial needs firmly in view. It's chaired by my good friend Sarah Champion, the Labour Member of Parliament for Rotherham, and she joins me now. Well, Sarah, welcome back to Committee Corridor.
Thank you.
The High Seas Treaty, it was formally adopted by UN member states in 2023, and the UK was one of the first to sign it, but it still hasn't actually been ratified. Now we're hearing legislation by the end of the year on it. Your committee's been pushing and we've been pushing. What's going on, do you think?
I don't know, but it's intensely frustrating. When 2 years ago we agreed to ratify it, it was seen as a real step forward to protecting our oceans and equally important to protecting the people that are dependent on our oceans. The fact that it seems to have been languishing in a drawer somewhere is disappointing. I know you and I both went to the event with Sir David Attenborough, in which Sir Keir spoke very passionately about his commitment to the oceans, and then we wrote to him and said, well, that's great that you're passionate, but can you please ratify this treaty? But I'm very, very pleased that they're now committing to it. But I don't know why it needs to take until Christmas. I mean, surely they can find parliamentary time before now for something quite so important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that has been the issue. The government's had a number of things they wanted to get done. This didn't seem to get to the top of the list. I think we both feel that, firstly, the UK needs to show that global leadership. And it was a bit embarrassing for our minister to be there at the recent Oceans Conference as one of the nations that hadn't yet ratified it. I mean, do you think the US will follow suit? How concerned are you about matters over there?
Who knows is the probably the most truthful I can be. I've just come out of a meeting with the World Food Programme, who deliver food to those facing famine all around the world, and they're worried about whether or not the US will continue supporting that. It's illogical to me what tends to happen. What I would say is my biggest concern is I know that President Trump is very concerned about critical minerals, and of course there are many critical minerals in the deep seas, and there's been a lot of concern and consternation by conservationists that he might be trying to go for those in the future.
And what do you see as the risks if the US don't follow suit? Is it primarily about minerals or any other matters? And do you think that the US sort of backsliding might lead to a domino effect and other nations sort of saying, well, if they're doing it, so can we?
Well, I think the reality is that the US is the leading power and has the majority of resources that is able to put into things like ocean conservation. I do think that it has a very critical role in leading other nations and showing the importance for things like this. But also it does concern me when Trump first came into office and he was talking about invading Greenland, for example. That's because of critical minerals. So I think we need to be looking more for leading nations to be looking at ways to work together with other, particularly the small islands, for everyone's benefit, rather than sort of diving in and trying to see what they can extract themselves.
Yeah, and your committee first called for the treaty to be ratified when you published your report on small island developing states in 2024. You described the states as the canary in the mine of global climate change. Just to expand upon what you found and why you came to that conclusion.
For me, it completely changed my perceptions on the world's ecosystem. I hadn't realised before then just how important something like a coral reef is. Not only is it a breeding ground for many of the species that we all sort of rely on and enjoy, so many fishes, many crustacea, for example, but also it's literally a barrier that protects from high seas some of the smaller islands around the world. So with those dying at a rapid rate, largely because of sea level warming, it's having a disproportionate impact on those islands. And just to give a little bit of context, some of the islands that we're talking about, like the Marshall Islands, they're a metre above sea level. So a metre rise, which we talk about quite casually, that would wipe out entire states. And there are other things, and it's why I'm so keen that we get the Oceans Treaty signed. Things like your fishing rights are based from the distance from your land out into the water. That defines your fishing rights. So as your land is reducing because of sea level rises, that also means that your land is reducing. And then if you take that to a logical extreme, if if your island is submerged, then you're not even a refugee, because when you're a refugee, it's because you've been forced from your homeland. And if you have no land, does that mean you have no rights whatsoever?
And I mean, you touched upon it there, but in terms of the term small island developing states, I mean, what specifically does that refer to in terms of the number of states and the geographical regions in which they exist?
This is a trick question that you're asking me, Toby, because this is one of the hotly fought topics, not least because many of the states refer to themselves as large ocean, states. So it's basically a distinct group of 39 states and 18 associated members, the United Nations Regional Commission. And they're largely in the Caribbean, the Pacific, the Atlantic and Indian Ocean, South China Seas. I think the thing for me and the ones that we looked at most closely is, whilst they may well be places that we would go to on holiday, so for Seychelles, for example, their population can be very, very low-income people. So we heard one really disturbing example in the Seychelles that two wealthy families, bought large estates in the same year, and that pushed them out of a low-income bracket, which meant that they didn't get any development money. So two people in a tiny population with a lot of money can really have devastating impacts on the country's economy. And I think, again, because a lot of the places that we're talking about are places that we go to celebrate, 60th anniversaries or weddings, we see the good side of it, but we don't see the poverty of it. And that's something that we all need to be concerned about.
Government strategy for small island developing states was set by the last government. It should run until 2026, next year. In the current government, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy spoke at COP29 to confirm some help for developing countries to deal with climate change. DEFRA Minister Emma Hardy spoke at the UN Ocean Conference in June. Does that suggest this government is engaged or not with marine governance?
I think it is engaged, but I think it's kind of an out of sight, out of mind topic. I think it's more obvious, for example, from a conservation point of view, the stuff that happens on land. An awful lot of the oceans haven't even been sort of recorded yet, so we don't actually know what we don't even know. I think perversely, because the government's most recent defence strategy recognises the undersea cables, that will probably make them recognise why we need to be much more minded about our sort of immediate seas and the risks that are associated with that. Another thing that really frustrates me is we have marine protected areas. We still have oil and gas licences in those marine protected areas. You would assume if it's defined a marine protected area, then that means just that. But unfortunately, only 3% around our coastline is properly protected from, for example, deep sea mining, bottom trawling. And so there's still huge risks that are not being dealt with or even recognised. So whilst I think the words and the intent are good, I need it to be seen with action alongside right now. That's when I'll believe that we're really committed to it.
And we had the UN Oceans Conference. We'll have COP30 in November. I mean, from your perspective, with your sort of internationalist focus on the International Development Committee, what do you think is the value of these summits?
You're definitely asking the wrong person. I am a cynic when it comes to these conferences. I try never to go to them. When I am dragged kicking and screaming to one, I see largely quite wealthy people. They are largely talking shops. The cost of them is astronomical. When you look at the carbon footprint of everyone flying in all over the world versus what actually gets achieved, I think it's very little. You and I are doing this interview on Zoom. There are ways that we can virtually gather together and make real decisions and change without having to spend a week in a different country. I just think if the money that went into enabling us all to go to the conferences was given to, for example, the people of the small island developing states, they would know how to use that money to protect the oceans probably a lot better than the talking shops that we seem to facilitate. You
said I've asked the wrong person. I think you asked the right person. You definitely have a strong perspective on that. Thank you very much indeed for joining us and your continued support for Committee Corridor. And very best of luck. We'll follow what your committee do with great interest.
Thank you.
The Environmental Audit Committee is in place to audit the progress of the government against its stated targets on environmental protection and sustainable development. How is it delivering on its targets for marine protection? How is it fulfilling its obligations under international marine treaties? So we ran an inquiry to find out. Joining me now is Pippa Heylings, a colleague of mine on the EAC. She's also the Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament for South Cambridgeshire. Pippa, welcome to Committee Corridor.
Hello, Toby. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
We published our report governing the marine environment in June, ahead of the United Nations Ocean Summit in Nice. We heard a lot of evidence. We made a lot of recommendations in our Select Committee report. From all of the recommendations and evidence that we were involved in, what really stood out for you?
I think what stood out, first of all, was the fact that we are really, even though we are saying a lot about what, as the UK government, in terms of our vision and policies for having healthy and diverse and productive marine environment, when we looked into it, Toby, what we found was that the action didn't match up to the word. And we had, on the one hand, the fact that most of the marine planning, the marine plans, were outdated and not fit for purpose for the many new challenges in our seas and oceans. So that, first of all. Secondly, that we have a failure to avoid and prevent really damaging practices within the marine protected areas, those areas we've set aside to be best, protected, including some of the most damaging seabed activities, which are, bottom trawling, dredging, and seabed mining. So the biggest conclusion we had that we had to recommend to the government to ban those damaging seabed activities such as bottom trawling, dredging, and seabed mining. And then thirdly, that we really needed to move forward and ratify our international position around the High Seas Treaty.
Well, that's excellent. We'll come on to some of those specific areas in a moment or two. In terms of the evidence that we heard, was there anything that you thought was particularly worrying, particularly concerning? Were there any particular low points for you?
Yeah, I think it was the fact that, we've seen such an increase in new activity, which are really good and positive activities, for example, like offshore wind. In 2024, our offshore wind development, they produced, huge amounts of our electricity being, used, 60% of that being used in the UK. And yet none of our marine plans are really managing to look at where should we be putting our renewable energy development, ensuring that we, offset that between the areas that we're looking at for nature recovery, for example. So the failure to really update our marine planning and our marine spatial prioritization program to enable us to minimize those conflicts and ensure that we can both do renewable energy and nature recovery and economic activities such as, fishing and shipping, that was for me, the really big disappointment.
And the committee set out to answer that central question of whether the government is currently delivering on its targets for marine protection. Do you think we achieved that?
I think we had a really good and hard look at the government's track record in delivering against that. And I think it's woeful, isn't it, Toby? That's what we saw, was that even though we saw evidence that particularly in our highly protected marine areas, which have only been created since 2023, there is a real demonstration that that's the most effective way for recovering nature. Yet, we haven't moved forward with that marine protection. We haven't brought in the fisheries management measures within those marine protected areas. And also we've allowed those damaging activities such as bottom trawling in our marine protected areas.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right that we heard about the damaging practices of bottom trawling, dredging, mining for aggregates on the seabed in offshore marine protected areas. You must have been delighted, as I was, that within 2 or 3 days of our report being published in advance of the Ocean Conference that the government did come out and finally say, right, we're going to be bringing forward legislation to ban them. Do you think that sort of demonstrates the way that select committees can make a difference when you have government maybe dragging its feet on things that they were committed to?
Yeah, I have to say that it was really, really impactful, that, Toby, because, you sometimes are concerned that if you're working within a select committee, a scrutiny committee, that really can you have an impact? And what we saw, we worked under huge pressure, didn't we? Because we wanted to produce this report in time ahead of the Oceans Conference to be able to influence the government's position so we could be a leader in marine conservation and help other countries to move forward too. So there was very, very little time then for the government to react. So I think we delivered the report on the 5th of June, and on the 10th of June, the government committed and announced that, it was going to ban bottom trawling in offshore marine protected areas, and was immediately going out to this consultation with industry on that. So that was just a prime example of how select committees, in the right conditions with serious work like this, and with a government that showed it was listening, that we can have an effect.
So we were talking also about the marine policy statement. Our marine policy statement dates back to about 2011 or 12. It has within it priority for oil and gas extraction. It has within it very little said about offshore energy. But in both those areas, the government's policy has changed, although its MPS hasn't. How important do you think it is that government actually gets on and changes that marine policy statement so that people know they're dealing with a document that actually reflects the policies of the government?
Yeah, so as I said, Toby, within the committee, what we saw was basically the marine policy statement it's outdated and it's not fit for purpose. So how on earth can we really be looking, on the one hand, at ensuring we've got the economic growth that's necessary through all of the different economic activities that we have, but we can really hit the clean power targets by 2030 through offshore wind, and at the same time we can recover nature according to the 30 by 30 targets on land and sea that we've also signed up to. And there's huge conflict, of different uses in this very small area. So it's absolutely unfathomable that we've got such an outdated document. And what we have to do is be able to minimize the conflicts that will obviously come out, for example, between, as I mentioned before, where we may be looking at placing offshore wind, if that's also looking at being in one of the areas that are really sensitive, and most biologically important and diverse. If we haven't got something in there that through the Marine Spatial Plan and the Spatial Prioritisation Programme that enables us to say what should happen where. That's the most basic thing, isn't it? What should happen where and why? So the government's given the policy, but it's left a huge mess about where that should happen. And that's why activities and plans are taking so long to get permission, which then is actually hindering on the one hand our economic growth and our race to accelerate our renewables and our leadership in offshore and floating offshore wind, whilst at the same time potentially creating irrevocable damage to our natural marine environment.
And we heard earlier from the Marine Conservation Society about the importance of cleaning up our seas, including action on forever chemicals. The select committee that you and I are on, the EAC, is taking evidence on PFAS at the moment. Just to explain to our listeners why the committee considered it important to look at the issue of these forever chemicals and what interests you particular in terms of that area.
As you said, these are about the forever chemicals that are getting into our waterways, our drinking water, our rivers and lakes, also into our seas, our coastal waters. And so it's a kind of a silent spring moment where we're looking at poisonous forever chemicals that pose real risk. For example, certain cancers, suppressing the immune system, impairing development, that can accumulate in the human body over time, leading to potentially long-term health effects. And also, because they're forever chemicals, they persist and accumulate in the environment, here as we're talking about the marine environment, which would cause them to, accumulate again in our wildlife. And because they're invisible and sort of long term, we're really worried that they're not being looked at carefully. They're in everyday things such as our, fast food packaging or, non-stick cookware, as well as things like firefighting foams and military use. So across all of that, I think it's really key that it's the Environmental Audit Committee that looks under the bonnet, lifts the cover on this and looks at whether the UK should actually be adopting a different approach, one more like other countries which have been far more progressive on this.
Well, Pippa Heylings, thank you so much for joining me, and we look forward to speaking again soon. My thanks to all my guests today. As Sir David Attenborough said recently, the most important place on earth is not on land. He also said, if we save the sea, we save the world. There's a lot of work to do. The next episode of Committee Corridor is the last in this series. We'll be talking clean power and hearing what select committees have to say about it. I'm Toby Perkins, and this has been Committee Corridor. Thank you very much for listening.